The Boeing 737 cruised at 38,000 feet above the Atlantic, its engines humming steadily through the darkness. In Seat 7A, Major Valentina Ghost Reeves dozed against the window, her weathered flight jacket bunched beneath her head as a makeshift pillow. The jacket bore no visible insignia except for a small, faded patch near the collar, a phantom aircraft silhouette that most passengers wouldn't recognize. She'd been awake for 36 hours straight, finishing paperwork at Ramstein before catching this red-eye back to Andrews. Her dirty blonde hair, still regulation length despite her medical retirement 18 months ago, caught the dim reading light from the row behind her. The intercom crackled to life at 2:47 hours Eastern Time. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison speaking." His voice carried an edge that made several passengers stir in their seats. "We're experiencing an unusual situation. If there are any current or former military officers aboard, specifically Air Force, please identify yourself to the flight crew immediately." Reeves's eyes snapped open before the announcement finished. She'd heard that tone before, controlled urgency masking something worse. Her fingers instinctively found the worn spot on her jacket where her wings used to sit. The businessman next to her was already pressing his call button, eager to watch whatever drama was unfolding. A flight attendant appeared within seconds, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. She leaned close to Reeves, who had raised one finger slightly, a gesture so subtle that nobody else noticed. "Ma'am, are you?" Major Reeves retired 4,000 hours in F-16s. She kept her voice low, already unbuckling. "What's your situation?" The attendant's relief was palpable. "The captain needs to speak with you immediately." As Reeves stood, she noticed three things simultaneously. The subtle bank of the aircraft beginning to alter course, the way the lead flight attendant was quietly checking oxygen masks in first class, and most tellingly, the reflection in the galley cart's surface showing the co-pilot's seat was empty. She followed the attendant forward, her body automatically adjusting to the plane's movements. The cockpit door opened before they reached it. Captain Morrison, gray-haired and steady-handed, glanced back with the kind of measured assessment she recognized from squadron commanders. "Ma'am, I'll be direct. My first officer experienced a medical emergency. He's stable but incapacitated. We're 4 hours from the nearest suitable landing site, and we're about to encounter significant weather. The automation can handle most of it, but regulations require—" He paused, studying her face. "I need someone who understands aviation in that right seat." Reeves was already moving past him, sliding into the co-pilot's position with practiced efficiency. Her hands found the familiar controls, though the Boeing's layout differed vastly from her Viper's cockpit. Through the windscreen, she could see the storm system building ahead, towering cumulonimbus clouds illuminated by lightning flashes that revealed their massive scale. "Ghost," she said quietly, adjusting the seat. "That's what they called me." Morrison glanced at her, one eyebrow raised at the unusual call sign. She began running through the co-pilot's abbreviated checklist, her movements crisp despite the 18-month gap since she'd flown anything. "Because I could put ordnance through a kitchen window from 40,000 feet, and nobody ever saw me coming." The captain relaxed marginally. "Morrison, 15,000 hours commercial, but I appreciate having someone who speaks the language up here." "Your first officer?" she asked, scanning the instruments. "Suspected stroke. Flight attendants have him stable in first class. Medical team will meet us on landing." Morrison adjusted their heading slightly. "You mentioned F-16s. Any multi-engine time?" T-38 trainers, some C-130 orientation. She was already studying the Boeing's flight management system, her tactical mind cataloging differences and similarities. But whether flying is whether flying. Physics doesn't change just because you're in something bigger. Lightning illuminated the massive wall of clouds ahead, revealing the storm system stretching across their route like a barrier. The radar painted harsh reds and magentas across the weather display. Morrison began outlining their situation. Blocked airports behind them due to weather, limited fuel for major deviations, and a cabin full of passengers who had no idea their flight had just become significantly more complicated. Reeves listened while simultaneously absorbing the instrument's information. The artificial horizon showed their stable attitude, but she could feel the first whispers of turbulence beginning to test the aircraft's edges. Her mind shifted into the tactical processing mode that had kept her alive through 47 combat missions. Evaluate, prioritize, execute. "We're going through it," Morrison stated rather than asked. "The gaps are closing," she confirmed, studying the weather radar. "But there's a relatively stable corridor if we adjust course 15 degrees south and request flight level 400. Morrison looked at her sharply. "You can read that from this." "Pattern recognition," she replied, tracing formations with one finger above the screen. "Storm cells behave like enemy formations. They have patterns, weaknesses. That corridor will hold for maybe 20 minutes before it closes." Boston Center, United 447 requesting flight level 400 and deviation 15 degrees south for weather, Morrison transmitted. As they waited for clearance, Reeves noticed Morrison's hands trembling slightly, not fear but fatigue. She recognized it immediately. "How long have you been flying this rotation?" she asked quietly. "This is day 6 of 7, we're short-staffed." He caught her look. "I'm within regulations." "I'm not questioning you, Captain, just observing." She adjusted the radar range. "I can handle the aircraft coordination if you want to focus on the weather navigation." The clearance came through, and Morrison began the climb while Reeves handled the radio calls. Her military communication style, precise, brief, unambiguous, cut through the increasingly busy frequency chatter as multiple aircraft began deviating around the storm system. She fell into the rhythm quickly, her hands remembering the dance of aviation despite the unfamiliar cockpit. But this was different from combat flying. There, the goal was often to push the aircraft to its limits. Here, surrounded by sleeping civilians who trusted them implicitly, the mission was smoothness, safety, invisibility. The passengers should never know how narrow their corridor through the storm really was. 20 minutes later, they entered the first wall of clouds. The aircraft bucked suddenly, violent enough that Morrison had to grip the yoke firmly. The sound of seatbelt signs illuminating filled the cockpit, followed by the lead flight attendant's calm announcement about unexpected turbulence. Reeves monitored the engine parameters as Morrison fought to maintain their altitude. Ice was beginning to form on the windscreen despite the heating systems. She reached for the anti-ice controls without being asked, her movements economical. "You've done this before," Morrison observed, wrestling with another severe updraft. "Different aircraft, same problems," she replied, "though usually people were shooting at us too." A massive lightning strike illuminated the entire cockpit, the flash leaving afterimages. The electrical systems flickered but held. Somewhere behind them, she could hear a child crying. The sound pulled at something in her chest. These weren't combat troops who'd signed up for danger. These were families, business travelers, people just trying to get home. The radio crackled with other aircraft reporting severe turbulence, deviations, and go-arounds at their destination. Boston Center was overwhelmed, their controller's voice showing the strain of managing multiple emergencies simultaneously. "United 447, be advised. Boston Logan is now reporting wind shear alerts and multiple missed approaches." Morrison and Reeves exchanged glances. Their fuel reserves gave them one shot at landing, maybe two if everything went perfectly. "Copy, Boston Center. United 447 requesting weather update for alternates," Reeves transmitted while Morrison continued fighting the controls. As they waited for response, she pulled up the fuel calculations on the flight management computer. Her fingers flew across the keypad, running scenarios. Bradley International possible, but the weather was moving that direction. Providence, too small for their aircraft weight. Manchester, viable but barely. Ghost, Morrison said, using her call sign for the first time. What's your assessment? She studied the displays, her tactical mind processing variables like she once processed threat matrices in hostile airspace. Boston's our best shot. The wind shear is bad, but it's consistent. We can calculate for it. The alternates will be worse by the time we get there. Morrison nodded slowly. Agreed, but this approach is going to be rough. Define rough, she said, already pulling up the approach plates for Logan's runway 33L. The kind where experience matters more than the automation. She looked at him directly. Then it's good you've got 15,000 hours. And it's good I've got someone in the right seat who understands what we're about to do, he replied. They began configuring for the approach, working through checklists with professional efficiency. Outside, the storm raged against the aircraft, testing every rivet and seal. But inside the cockpit, there was only focused calm, two pilots from different worlds bringing their combined experience to bear on a singular problem. As they descended through 20,000 feet, Reeves found herself thinking about her last flight in the F-16. It had ended with a bird strike that destroyed her engine, forcing her to eject over Afghanistan. The injuries from that ejection had ended her Air Force career, compressed vertebrae that disqualified her from fighter aircraft forever. She'd thought her flying days were over. But here she was, hands steady on unfamiliar controls, helping guide 200 souls through nature's fury. Different mission, same purpose, bring everyone home. United 447, turn heading 030, descend to 15,000, expect vectors for ILS approach runway 33 left, Boston approach called out. 030, descending to 15,000, vectors for 33 left, United 447, she replied, then to Morrison. Want me to brief the approach? Please. As she began detailing the approach procedure, Morrison found himself reassessing his initial read of the woman in the co-pilot seat. When she'd first sat down, he'd seen tired eyes in civilian clothes, heard retired, and wondered if he'd made a mistake. But watching her work, the way she anticipated needs, managed multiple information streams, communicated with razor precision, he recognized something he'd seen in only a handful of aviators over his long career. She wasn't just competent, she was exceptional. The turbulence increased as they descended, the aircraft shuddering through wind shear layers. Warning chimes sounded intermittently, altitude deviations, speed fluctuations, autopilot disconnections. Morrison hand flew while Reeves managed everything else, their coordination seamless despite having met 30 minutes ago. United 447, winds at Logan now 340 at 45, gusting 65. Several aircraft have executed missed approaches. State your intentions. Morrison looked at the fuel gauges, then at Reeves. Your call, Ghost. She processed the information instantly. We have fuel for one approach and a climb out to Manchester if needed. The winds are strong but straight down the runway. Manageable if we nail the crab angle on final. Agreed, Morrison keyed the radio. Boston approach, United 447 continuing approach. They broke through the cloud base at 2,000 feet, rain streaming across the windscreen so heavily the wipers couldn't keep up. The runway lights appeared through the murk like a salvation path, but the aircraft was bucking violently, requiring constant control inputs to maintain anything resembling stable flight. 500 feet, Reeves called out. Sync rate good, 20 knots correction for wind. Continuing, Morrison replied, his hands firm on the yoke. 400 on glide path, speed good. The wind shear alarm sounded. a harsh warning that conditions were beyond normal parameters. 300, runway in sight, you're 15 knots fast but stable. Morrison didn't respond verbally, his entire focus on wrestling the Boeing toward the runway. The aircraft yawed suddenly, forcing him to apply heavy rudder input. 200, slightly high, correcting. Through the rain, the runway approach lights strobed past. The aircraft was crabbing at such an extreme angle it looked like they were flying sideways. 100, approaching minimums. Continuing, Morrison said through gritted teeth. 50 feet. Morrison kicked the rudder hard, aligning the aircraft with the runway just as the main gear touched down. The Boeing slammed onto the concrete harder than any normal landing, bouncing slightly before settling. Morrison immediately deployed the thrust reversers and speed brakes, fighting to keep the aircraft centered as crosswinds tried to shove them toward the grass. They decelerated hard, water spraying up from the wheels in massive plumes. Finally, as they slowed to taxi speed, Morrison exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. "Nice landing," Reeves said quietly. "Nice everything else," he replied. As they taxied toward the gate, the lead flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, professionally thanking passengers for their patience during the slightly bumpy ride. Morrison actually laughed, a release of tension that Reeves recognized from post-mission debriefs. "Ghost," Morrison said as they ran the after-landing checklist. "That's an interesting call sign for someone who just saved 200 people in full view of everyone." She was quiet for a moment, watching the ground crew scramble in the rain to prepare for their arrival. "It's because I was good at disappearing. Never took credit, never stood out. Just completed the mission and vanished into the background." "And now?" She considered the question. Through the cockpit door, she could hear the passengers beginning to gather their belongings, unaware of how close they'd come to catastrophe. "Now I'm just a passenger in 7A. Morrison shut down the engines as they reached the gate. "No, now you're the reason everyone on this aircraft gets to go home tonight." Medical personnel were already waiting on the jet bridge for the incapacitated first officer. As Reeves gathered her things to leave the cockpit, Morrison stood and did something unusual. He saluted. Not the casual wave pilots sometimes exchanged, but a proper military salute. "It's been an honor, Major." She returned it reflexively, then smiled, the first genuine smile she'd allowed herself in 18 months. "Likewise, Captain." She slipped out of the cockpit before the passengers began deplaning. Returning to collect her bag from 7A, the businessman next to her seat was complaining loudly about the rough landing, suggesting the pilots didn't know what they were doing. Reeves said nothing, just pulled on her worn flight jacket and joined the queue to exit. As she walked up the jet bridge, she passed the medical team wheeling out the first officer. He was conscious now, giving a weak thumbs up to the crew. Behind her, she could hear Captain Morrison beginning to explain to the gate agents what had happened, his voice carrying over the crowd noise. Exceptional pilot, couldn't have done it without her, Major Valentina Reeves, Ghost. But by the time anyone thought to look for her, she had already disappeared into the anonymous flow of Logan Airport's early morning travelers. Just another tired passenger heading home. 2 days later, Morrison was filing his incident report in United's Boston office when the chief pilot walked in with a tablet. "You need to see this," the chief said, turning the screen toward Morrison. It was a military commendation report from 3 years earlier. Major Valentina Ghost, Reeves had saved an entire special operations team in Afghanistan by flying her F-16 through a sandstorm to provide close air support, staying on station despite critical fuel levels until rescue helicopters arrived. The citation noted her extraordinary ability to operate in zero-visibility conditions and her refusal to accept recognition, insisting the rescue pilots receive the credit. "That's her," Morrison said quietly. "That's the woman who was in my right seat." "Gets better," the chief pilot continued, scrolling to another document. 18 months ago, she ejected from her aircraft after a bird strike, saved a village from the crash by steering the plane away until the last possible second. Compression fractures ended her flying career. Medical retirement at 34. Morrison stared at the photograph attached to the file. A formal military portrait showing a younger Reeves in dress blues, multiple decorations on her chest, eyes focused somewhere beyond the camera. "We need to find her," Morrison said. "The company wants to recognize." "She's already gone," the chief pilot interrupted. "Checked out of her hotel that morning, phone number disconnected. The Air Force says she does this, helps when needed, then vanishes. It's why they called her Ghost." Morrison looked out the window at the steady stream of aircraft taking off and landing. Somewhere out there, Valentina Reeves was probably sitting in another passenger seat, anonymous and unrecognized, carrying the weight of a career cut short and skills that could no longer be officially used. But for one night, in the worst storm Boston had seen in a decade, she'd been exactly where she needed to be. 6 months passed. Morrison was preparing for another transatlantic flight when he spotted a familiar figure in the boarding area, worn flight jacket, dirty blonde hair, quietly reading a paperback near the window. He walked over, casting a shadow across her book. "Seat 7A again." Reeves looked up, a slight smile playing at her lips. "I like the view." "Listen, the company has a standing offer. We need experienced pilots, and medical retirement from the Air Force doesn't disqualify you from commercial aviation. You could fly again, officially." She marked her page carefully before closing the book. "Captain Morrison." "Paul." "Paul, I flew fighters because I loved it. When that ended, I thought that part of me died." She stood, shouldering her bag. "But that night showed me something different. I don't need to be in the cockpit to matter. Sometimes being in 7A is enough." "But your skills." "Will be there if needed." She moved toward the boarding line. "That's what ghosts do. We appear when necessary, then fade back into the background." Morrison watched her board, taking her usual window seat. As he performed his pre-flight walk-around, he found himself checking the passenger manifest. There it was, V. Reeves, 7A. He made an unusual addition to his pre-flight briefing that day, speaking over the intercom as they pushed back from the gate. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're expecting smooth flying conditions today, but I want you to know that whatever conditions we encounter, you're in good hands. Not just the crew you can see, but sometimes the ones you can't. Aviation is a community, and we look out for each other, whether we're in uniform or not." In 7A, Reeves smiled slightly and returned to her book. Outside her window, F-16s from the nearby Air Force Base traced contrails across the clear morning sky, ghosts themselves, visible only by the marks they left behind. 3 years later, during what would become known as the Miracle on the Hudson River Redux, a regional jet lost both engines to a bird strike over Connecticut. The pilot managed to land the aircraft safely on a highway after a passenger, identified only as a former military aviator, talked him through an energy management technique typically used by fighter pilots for flame-out landings. The passenger disappeared before media arrived, leaving investigators with only a seat number, 7A. Captain Paul Morrison, watching the news coverage from his hotel room in London, raised his coffee cup in a silent toast to the empty air. Somewhere out there, Ghost was still flying, just not in the way anyone expected. The FAA investigation into the highway landing included interviews with surviving passengers. Most remembered very little from the chaos, but one flight attendant recalled something specific. "There was this woman. She was so calm, like she'd done this 100 times before. She told me to keep the passengers' heads down and count to 30 after touchdown before beginning evacuation. When I asked how she knew that, she said, 'Because I've calculated how long it takes for fuel vapor to dissipate.' Then she helped me open the emergency exits. By the time I turned to thank her, she was already gone. The official report noted the unidentified passengers' contributions, but couldn't establish their identity. The seat assignment system had glitched that day, showing no passenger assigned to 7A, though multiple witnesses confirmed someone had been sitting there. In the margins of his personal copy of the report, Morrison wrote a single word: ghost. The thing about ghosts, Morrison had come to understand, was that they weren't really about being invisible. They were about being present without being seen, about impact without recognition, about service without credit. In a world obsessed with visibility and fame, there was something profound about someone who possessed extraordinary skills and chose to use them only when absolutely necessary, without any expectation of acknowledgement. He thought about this often during his flights, especially when passing through turbulence or dealing with challenging weather. Somewhere in the cabin behind him might be another ghost, a retired military pilot, an off-duty air traffic controller, a fellow aviator who would step forward if needed but otherwise remained contentedly anonymous. The aviation community, Morrison realized, was full of such ghosts. A year later, Morrison was reviewing applications for United's new mentorship program when he found an unexpected submission. The applicant listed extensive military aviation experience, but no name, just an identification number and the note: available for emergency consultation only. No publicity, no records, no recognition required. The phone number provided connected to a secure voicemail system. Morrison left a message. Ghost, this is Paul Morrison. Your application for the mentorship program has been accepted on your terms. We'll create a protocol. If any of our pilots encounter conditions beyond their experience, they can request Consultant 7 Alpha. You can help them through it, no questions asked, no names exchanged. Consider it. Ghost flying. The return message came 12 hours later, just 2 words: copy that. The program quietly launched 3 months later. In its first year, Consultant 7 Alpha helped 17 pilots navigate everything from unusual system failures to severe weather events. The pilots never knew who was on the other end of the line, only that the voice was calm, competent, and seemed to have an uncanny ability to understand exactly what they were experiencing. One young first officer, after successfully handling his first major electrical failure with 7 Alpha's guidance, asked, "Who are you?" The response was gentle but firm: "Just someone in 7A." The legend grew quietly within United's pilot corps. 7 Alpha became shorthand for the invisible network of expertise that existed throughout aviation: the retired pilots, the military veterans, the experienced aviators who flew as passengers but remained ready to serve if called upon. Morrison instituted an informal protocol. Whenever a pilot spotted someone in 7A reading a flying manual, wearing old wings, or showing the subtle signs of aviation experience, they'd make a mental note, just in case. 5 years after that first stormy night over the Atlantic, Morrison was conducting his final flight before retirement. As he performed his last walkthrough of the cabin, he stopped at 7A. The seat was empty, but tucked into the seat pocket was a small note. "Fair winds and following seas, Captain. Thank you for understanding that not all pilots need to be in the cockpit to fly. G." He kept the note, framing it alongside his retirement memorabilia. When asked about it, he'd simply say it was from the best co-pilot he'd ever flown with, one who taught him that sometimes the most profound acts of service come from those who seek no recognition at all. At Morrison's retirement ceremony, the chief pilot mentioned the night of the Atlantic storm, praising Morrison's skill in handling the emergency. Morrison stopped him mid-speech. "That night wasn't about me. It was about what happens when the right person is in the right place, even if that place is just a passenger seat. We talk about crew resource management, but sometimes our greatest resource is sitting in row 7, reading a paperback, ready to help but expecting nothing in return. He raised his glass to the assembled pilots. To the ghosts among us, may we recognize them when needed, respect their choice to remain invisible, and remember that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform or seek the spotlight. Somewhere in Boston, in a small apartment overlooking Logan Airport, Valentina Reeves watched aircraft take off and land through her window. Her flight jacket hung on a hook by the door, the phantom aircraft patch barely visible in the evening light. On her desk, next to her current book, sat a simple brass nameplate she'd had made. VREVS 7A, always on duty. She'd found her way to keep flying after all. Not in the cockpit, not with recognition, but as a guardian angel at 38,000 feet, ready to step forward when needed, content to step back when not. Tomorrow she had a ticket for another transatlantic flight, seat assignment 7A. As always, the phone rang, her secure line, the one only a handful of people knew about. The voice on the other end was young, uncertain. Consultant 7 Alpha, this is United 892, we have a situation. Reeves set down her book, already shifting into tactical mode. United 892, 7 Alpha here, tell me what you're seeing. For the next 40 minutes, she talked a young captain through his first catastrophic hydraulic failure, her voice calm and steady as she guided him through manual reversion procedures she'd learned in combat aircraft, but which translated perfectly to his Boeing 757. When he landed safely at Denver International, shaking but successful, he asked the question they always asked, "How can I thank you?" "You just did," she replied. "Fly safe, United 892. She hung up and returned to her book, but found herself thinking about something Morrison had said during that first flight. Aviation is a community. He was right, but communities weren't just about the visible members, the captains, the controllers, the crew. They were also about the invisible network of experience and expertise that existed in the shadows, ready to emerge when darkness fell. Her laptop chimed with a secure message. Another airline, Delta this time, had heard about the consultant program and wanted to know if 7 Alpha would consider expanding operations. Reeves typed a simple reply, "Send protocols, we'll review." Within 6 months, the 7 Alpha network had quietly spread across major carriers. Former military pilots, retired commercial aviators, experienced flight engineers, all connected through a secure system, all available for emergency consultation, none seeking recognition. They called themselves the Ghost Network, and their only identifying mark was a small pin worn on civilian clothes, a phantom aircraft silhouette that most people wouldn't notice or recognize. Morrison, enjoying his retirement but staying connected to the aviation community, became the unofficial historian of the Ghost Network. He documented their interventions, always anonymously, always respectfully. His files contained dozens of incidents where disaster had been averted by a voice on the phone, a passenger who stepped forward, an invisible hand guiding aircraft to safety. One evening, at an aviation safety conference, Morrison presented his findings to a room full of industry leaders. "We spend millions on technology, training, and procedures," he said. "But our greatest safety asset might be the people we never see, the ghosts in row 7, the retired pilots flying as passengers, the vast network of expertise that travels with us every day." He clicked to his final slide, a simple image of an empty passenger seat. Seat 7A represents more than a location on an aircraft. It represents the idea that help can come from anywhere, that heroism doesn't require recognition, and that sometimes the most important person on your flight is the one you never know is there. The conference room was silent for a moment, then erupted in discussion. Within a year, the International Air Transport Association had formally recognized the Ghost Network, though its members remained as invisible as ever. Airlines began reserving Seat 7A on select flights for traveling aviation professionals, understanding that these ghosts provided an invaluable safety buffer. Reeves watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. She'd never intended to start a movement. She'd just been a tired pilot trying to get home who stepped up when needed. But sometimes, she reflected, the most powerful changes came from the simplest actions. 10 years after that stormy Atlantic crossing, a young female Air Force pilot, medically retired after an ejection injury, found herself crying in the bathroom at Denver International. Her flying career was over at 28, her identity as a pilot seemingly erased with a doctor's signature. An older woman entered, wearing a worn flight jacket with a barely visible patch. She said nothing at first, just handed the younger woman a tissue. F-22, she asked, nodding the subtle unit patch on the young pilot's bag. Came the bitter reply. Compressed vertebrae, never flying again. Reeves leaned against the sink. I told myself the same thing. F-16s 18 years ago, birds strike over Afghanistan. The younger pilot looked up, recognizing something in the older woman's eyes. But here's what I learned, Reeves continued. You never stop being a pilot. You just fly differently. Sometimes from 7A instead of the cockpit. Sometimes as a voice on the phone guiding someone through an emergency. Sometimes as the invisible expert who prevents disasters nobody ever knows about. She pulled out a business card. Plain white, no name, just a phone number and a small Phantom aircraft symbol. When you're ready, call this number. The Ghost Network could use someone with your experience. Ghost Network. Reeves smiled. We're the pilots nobody sees but everybody needs. We don't fly the aircraft anymore, but we still bring people home. She left the younger woman holding the card, staring at it like it might contain the answer to an impossible question. 6 months later, Consultant 7 Bravo joined the network. Within a year, she'd helped 3 crews navigate severe emergencies, her expertise in advanced fighter operations translating into split-second decision-making guidance that saved lives. The Ghost Network grew, evolved, became something larger than any individual member. But at its heart remained the same principle Reeves had embodied that night over the Atlantic. Step forward when needed, step back when not, and never forget that the mission, bringing everyone home safely, matters more than recognition. Morrison, now in his 70s, still flew occasionally as a passenger. He always checked Seat 7A, and more often than not, he'd spot the signs. The worn flight jacket, the weather-beaten face, the eyes that automatically scanned instruments visible from the cabin, the subtle tension during takeoff that spoke of muscle memory wanting to control the aircraft. On one such flight, encountering severe turbulence over the Rockies, he watched a younger ghost, 7 Bravo, he suspected, discreetly help a terrified passenger with breathing exercises while simultaneously keeping one ear tuned to the engine sounds, ready to move forward if the flight crew needed assistance. They never did. The turbulence passed, the flight continued, and 7 Bravo returned to her book as if nothing had happened. But Morrison knew better. He'd seen the micro-expressions, the instant of calculation as she'd assessed whether intervention was needed, the ready tension that had relaxed only when the aircraft stabilized. After landing, he caught up with her at baggage claim. 7 Bravo. She turned, surprised. Captain Morrison, 7 Alpha told me about you. How is she? Still flying from 7A, still disappearing when the job's done. She paused. She saved my career, you know. Not my flying career, that was over, but my purpose. She showed me that losing the cockpit didn't mean losing the sky. Morrison nodded. She showed me something too, that the best pilots aren't always the ones in the front of the aircraft. They parted ways, 2 members of an invisible fraternity that spanned the globe. In airports everywhere, ghosts moved through security, boarded aircraft, and took their seats, ordinary passengers to anyone watching, but an extraordinary safety net for global aviation. The FAA never officially acknowledged the ghost network, but internal memos suggested awareness at the highest levels. Accident rates on flights with identified ghosts aboard were statistically lower, not because the ghosts intervened, but because their mere presence seemed to elevate everyone's performance, a phenomenon psychologists called expertise proximity effect. Reeves, now approaching 50, had quietly become 7 Alpha Senior, coordinating the network's training protocols and emergency response procedures. She still flew passenger regularly, still sat in 7A when possible, still disappeared the moment her help was no longer needed. But late at night, in her apartment overlooking Logan, she maintained the network, matching experienced ghosts with airlines that needed them, developing communication protocols that preserved anonymity while ensuring effectiveness, building a shadow organization that operated entirely on trust, competence, and the shared understanding that aviation safety transcended ego. One evening, she received an unexpected call, not on the emergency line but on her personal phone, a number almost nobody knew. Major Reeves, the voice was military official. Retired, she corrected. Ma'am, this is General Sarah Chen, current commander of Air Combat Command. I'm calling about the Ghost Network. Reeves said nothing, waiting. We know what you've built. We know what you do. And frankly, we're impressed. The Air Force would like to discuss formal integration, not to control or publicize, but to ensure our retiring pilots know this option exists. With respect, General, the moment it becomes official is the moment it stops working. Ghosts can't have shadows. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then how do we help? You already are. Every pilot you train, every standard you maintain, every tradition of service you instill, they all feed into what we do. When pilots leave the Air Force, they don't stop being warriors. They just fight different battles against weather and mechanical failures instead of enemy aircraft. But surely there's something. There is, Reeves interrupted. Stop telling them their flying days are over when they medically retire. Tell them their flying days are just changing. Plant the seed that service continues beyond the cockpit. That's all. After ending the call, Reeves walked to her window. A United 777 was rotating off runway 33L, climbing into the evening sky. She wondered if there was a ghost aboard, reading a book in 7A, ready to step forward if needed. Statistics suggested there probably was. The Ghost Network's most significant test came during what aviation historians would later call the Black Tuesday event, a cascading series of system failures that affected multiple aircraft simultaneously due to a software glitch in air traffic control systems. 17 aircraft in various stages of flight suddenly lost communication with ATC, their pilots forced to navigate and separate themselves using only visual references and aircraft-to-aircraft communication. Within minutes, the Ghost Network activated. 7 Alpha took calls from 3 different aircraft simultaneously, coordinating their